From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman is feeling a little under the weather today, but we do have the Iron Man, the Lou Gehrig of Justice and Democracy, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Good to be with our listeners. These are two very important subjects.
Yes, and before we get going, I want to give a shout out to our new affiliate, WPFW in Washington, D.C. Thanks to General Manager Jerry Paris and Program Director Katia Stitt for making that happen. We're on Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m. in D.C. Welcome, D.C. On last week's show, those of you who heard that, we talked to journalist Gareth Porter about the menace that is John Bolton, Donald Trump's choice to replace H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor. And I did a little research, which I want to do every once in a while, and found out that the role of National Security Advisor came into being in 1953 during the Cold War. And it's an important position because he or she works in the West Wing with easy access to the president and the ability to control the flow of information to the president. So in our interview with Mr. Porter, Ralph referenced an article by constitutional scholar Bruce Fein about how this position has become so important and influential that it needs to be subject to confirmation by the Senate, just like any other major cabinet position. And today we have Bruce Fein on the program to argue in person the case against John Bolton. He'll be our first guest. Also on the show, we're going to be talking to Jack Gillis, who is the co-author of The Car Book, a consumer guide to help you buy a smart, sensible, and safe automobile. The Car Book for 2018 has just come out, so we'll give you a preview of that, as well as our weekly report on corporate crime with Russell Mokhiber. And if we have some time at the end, we'll answer a listener question or two. But first, let's continue our campaign against the appointment of war hawk John Bolton. Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar who is Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Fein has been a visiting fellow for constitutional studies at the Heritage Foundation and an adjunct scholar at American Enterprise Institute. He's advised numerous countries on constitutional reform, including South Africa, Hungary, and Russia. He's the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Bruce. This is subjects affect every American because if John Bolton maintains his appointment in the White House next to Donald Trump, there's going to be war. John Bolton is a avowed, open war hawk. He makes no points about it. And we will talk with you, Bruce Fein, about the various wars and bombings and illegalities that he has been associated with. What impresses me most about John Bolton is he's a soliloquist. He's a unilateral communicator. He's obviously not giving any interviews these days, but he has no interest in complying or adjusting his foreign and military policies to international law, federal statutes, and the Constitution itself. You mentioned in your new article in the Washington Times on John Bolton, which is titled, Bolton Appointment Should Jolt Congress into Action, the Nuremberg trials. And when Justice Jackson, who presided, Supreme Court Justice Jackson, who took a leave from the Supreme Court to preside over the Nuremberg trials in Germany after World War II, he noted quite clearly, I remember, that the Nuremberg principles of accountability don't just apply to Germany, they apply internationally to all countries, and he specifically mentioned the United States. So let's say today there is a contemporary Nuremberg-type trial, and John Bolton is the defendant, and you're the prosecutor. What would be your stipulated accusations?
Well, if we want to, the ones that are most directly applicable are conspiracy to wage, aggressive war. Conspiracy was a charge, and that conspiracy charge was lodged against a whole host of Nazi officials who, from early on in Hitler's administration, were plotting and planning aggressive war against Poland and Czechoslovakia. I did include Anschluss with Austria because that was not thought to be war. But then, it continued on throughout the war when he was launching attacks against Greece and Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, Romania, Soviet Union, and United States, and whatever. So we do have enshrined into international law the Nuremberg Principle that a conspiracy, which is an agreement to conduct aggressive war, means a war not in self-defense. That's also a principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter, to which we're a signatory. And Mr. Bolton clearly was part of a group who plotted and conspired to conduct aggressive war against Iraq in 2003. Iraq was not a danger to the United States. Our United States Congress did not declare war against Iraq. And Saddam Hussein, if anything, he was someone who we assisted in his 8-year war with Iran that had at least ended in somewhat might call a stalemate. So we, in fact, were supporting him with intelligence. We gave him chemicals that he used to engage in chemical warfare against Kurds in Halabja. And he was not, if anything, not only was he not ready to attack the United States, if anything, he was a barrier to what we had called our arch enemy, Iran. So there's no plausible foundation for arguing that our invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a war in self-defense.
And what was the position in the government of John Bolton at that time?
I think at that time, I think he was Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department.
Under Colin Powell.
Yes, that is correct, under Colin Powell, and fully supportive of the invasion. And then, at least at present, he is called, although it's hard to argue he's a conspiracy because at least we're thankful he doesn't have any other person who's agreed with him. He is called for unconstitutional wars in violation of international law against Iran and North Korea, claiming that because they either have or have an ambition to acquire nuclear weapons. By the way, arsenals at their best would be a tiny, tiny fraction of what the United States has and uses every day in its international diplomacy to coerce and to get other countries to do our bidding. He's campaigned for launching wars of aggression. Again, North Korea is not attacking us. Iran is not attacking the United States. If anything, the one who's contributed the most to our fear of international terrorism is Saudi Arabia, to which we're selling $112 billion of weapons. So I don't know whether or not simply calling for the wars but not having a group, a conspiracy, would quite pass the threshold of a war crime. But it gets close, and of course, if he had his way, he definitely would be complicit in the war crimes against the two nations.
And since Donald Trump campaigned as a non-interventionist in 2016, how's that mixture going to work out with John Bolton next to him in the White House?
Well, it's a very combustible combination, if you will. Now, Mr. Trump, of course, he's flouted a lot of things that he campaigned on. He's not the first politician to do that. But since his inauguration, he has not, in terms of action, he has not withdrawn a single troop from any of the 9 presidential wars unconstitutional that are ongoing. We have special forces in 172 countries. Now, he talks like he says he wants to get out of Syria. At one time, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. He said Iraq is a failed enterprise, but he hasn't done anything to suggest that he's diminishing our military profile. And even with regard to Russia, he's the one who's now armed Ukraine in opposition to Putin's encroachment, at least in the portion of Ukraine that had Russian ethnics, and the annexation of Crimea. So he talks non-intervention, and maybe he feels it, but the military-industrial complex has got sufficient power that, at least at present, after a year and a half, he's acquiesced in virtually every request that they've made. But who knows? If Mr. Trump is somebody who's not consistent, he's erratic, and he could stand up one day and he could fire John Bolton because of the conflict. Or he could ultimately change his mind and say, well, things have changed, or my military advisor to do something. It's not something that's easily predictable because Mr. Trump doesn't have any fixed principles that guide his decisions.
Well, there's a report just recently on Real News Network by Phyllis Bennis, who is at the Institute for Policy Studies and a very accurate author of books on Afghanistan, on Palestine, and other subjects. And she recounts that when Bolton was the U.S. ambassador to the UN when Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006. In the first 3 days, there was an effort by Condoleezza Rice, apparently, to try to get a ceasefire. And Bolton went to the home of the Israeli ambassador to the UN in New York City to basically urge him to try to get the president or the prime minister of Israel to contact George W. Bush and reverse any attempt to have a ceasefire. And apparently it worked because the war continued for another 28 days or so. Lebanon was blown apart in so many ways, infrastructure, lives lost, and other destruction. And this was remarkable in the sense that he was sabotaging his own administration that was trying to get a ceasefire by becoming what Phyllis Bennis calls, quote, an asset for Israel against the interests of his own Secretary of State, his own State Department, his own superiors, and his own president, end quote. And she takes this from well-documented sources, such as the recent autobiography of the former president of Israel, Obert. What do you think of all that? What kind of legal sanction should that have brought upon John Bolton in 2006?
Well, obviously it's insubordination and could all justify his firing. Moreover, it's almost semi-treasonous in the sense that his loyalties seem to be more with the government of Israel rather than to the government of the United States. It reminds me a little bit of what, during World War I, Colonel House would go share our cables with the British ambassador before we'd send them off, so we could aid Britain during the war. You ordinarily, as a country, don't share your most confidential foreign policy communications with another country, their ambassador, before you move forward.
Who was Colonel House?
Colonel House was a $1-a-year man, if you will, very, very close to President Woodrow Wilson, was instrumental in his climb into the presidency, and though he had no formal position, he was as close to Woodrow Wilson in foreign policy than anyone else.
Well, let's get back to the post of the National Security Advisor to the President. John Bolton is going to start work, apparently, formally on April 9th. Is he going to get a top-secret security clearance, and how long would that take? And if he doesn't get it, how can he stay in the job?
Well, the President of the United States has authority to identify anybody as sufficiently reliable and trustworthy to receive classified information. And my expectation is that Mr. Trump would do that for Mr. Bolton even before a security clearance was given. The clearance process itself with someone who has such a network of international contacts probably take 3 or 4 months unless, the FBI turned all their assets on contacting all the foreign officials that he's been communicating with over the years. That one of the purposes, of course, is to determine whether there's anything in the background that could expose the appointee to blackmail because there's something embarrassing that could be disclosed, even if it's far short of criminal. And the other element was, with regard to the appointment, the Constitution is quite clear, the Appointments Clause, Article 2, Section 2, that any, quote, officer of the United States, is subject to the confirmation of the Senate unless Congress provides otherwise for inferior officers. And Congress didn't even create the position of a National Security Advisor. It was by executive decree in 1953. And moreover, even assuming that at the outset it was a very small office, most people can't even remember the first names of the individuals who occupied that position at the outset. Like Gordon Gray, the father of the later White House counsel Boyden Gray. Gordon Gray was his father, but he was not somebody who appeared in the papers. There's no Henry Kissinger. And the Constitution doesn't exalt form over substance, and there's a matter of substance now. There's no doubt that the National Security Advisor is more powerful and influential than Secretary of State. At one time, during Jimmy Carter's administration, he elevated Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was his National Security Advisor, to cabinet-level status. And whether they have that particular title or not, there isn't any doubt that it's the National Security Advisor with a staff now ranging up to 400 that runs the foreign policy of the United States. Henry Kissinger did the opening to China, not William Rogers, and it's preposterous that the cabinet officers are subject to Senate confirmation, and the National Security Advisor is not. And background and Senate confirmation makes a difference. It's no doubt in my mind that Michael Flynn would never have been confirmed if he was up there as National Security Advisor, if there were actual confirmation hearings and would have been disclosed all of these efforts, undertakings where he was a foreign agent for Turkey and wasn't registered as a foreign agent, having handsomely paid for attending banquets with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, and his various and sundry communications with foreign officials, including the Russian ambassador, before inauguration. I mean, that's the safeguard of confirmation hearings. That's why you have them.
In a Senate controlled by the Republican Party, would John Bolton have difficulty being confirmed?
Oh, hugely difficulty, because even when you had a Republican Senate under President George W. Bush, and he appointed Bolton as United Nations ambassador in 2005, he couldn't get confirmed. He's a very acerbic, irascible personality, and he's not inclined to win friends. And, of course, he treats Congress as though it's an afterthought. That's why, he doesn't believe in the declare war clause. He says, well, he wants to go to war against Iran and North Korea unilaterally. Congress has the only power to declare and authorize the initiation of war.
How did he become ambassador then if he wasn't confirmed?
There's a Vacancy Act that a president, because, when Congress recesses, he became someone who was appointed unilaterally by the president under the Vacancy Act, but he could only serve till the next Congress concluded, so it was about 360 days, and then he left because he knew if his name was thrown into the confirmation queue, he'd never get confirmed. But that's how he served for a little less than a year under the Vacancy Act.
And what's going on in Congress now to make it a confirmable office as National Security Advisor to the President?
One bill has been introduced by a member from Illinois, a Democrat, to require that by statute that the National Security Advisor be confirmed. This is not unprecedented. Congress over the years has required the General Counsel of the CIA to be confirmed, the Inspector General of the CIA to be confirmed, and even, Ralph, we have the Board of Trustees of the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts as confirmation status for those trustees. And say the National Security Advisor, he would literally, given the devastating power of our nuclear forces, could destroy every single living thing on the planet with exhortations and assertions and arguments in the White House. Not subject to Senate confirmation is preposterous on its face.
And you mentioned in your article in the Washington Times that he unmasked the names of Americans whose conversations had been intercepted by the National Security Agency under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. And he also accused Fidel Castro, of developing chemical and biological weapons. Can you describe that? And why did he keep his job after that?
Well, the fact is that he does have support from what we call the extreme right wing, the war party, if you will. And they funded his campaign as a stalking horse, I think, to oppose Trump during 2016 because Trump wasn't sufficiently aggressive. He didn't want to fight more wars, at least verbally. That was his campaign slogan. And so he does have money who maybe it's probably, as I'm speculating here, people like Sheldon Adelson, who would put lots of money. Sheldon Adelson is a huge funder of the Republican Party. Sheldon Adelson, wants the United States and Israel to rule the world. He had never seen a war that he hasn't liked. And so he's able to develop, that small level of huge support from very, very rich donors. And unfortunately, the military-industrial complex largely supports the overall theory of international relations, if you want to call it, of Mr. Bolton, which is, hey, we don't do diplomacy. If you don't do what we want you to do, we just bomb you. Mother of all bombs, Predator drones, or things of that sort. They just aren't as bellicose as Mr. Bolton is.
I mean, imagine Assistant Secretary of State keeping his job after falsely claiming Fidel Castro was developing chemical and biological weapons. When I was interviewing Castro after that in Cuba, on a visit to Cuba, Castro thought that was a precursor to a U.S. attack on Cuba. And then Secretary of State, his superior, Bolton's superior, pounced on him and retracted this accusation, saying it was false. And Bolton still had his job, even after leaking the names of people undercover. Here he is, a avowed defier of the Constitution and international law. We're not talking shades of gray, listeners. This guy's open about it. and he keeps getting promoted. There are much more serious grounds where he, along with others who engaged in the criminal invasion of Iraq, should have been prosecuted, tried, and convicted of war crimes under international treaties and under our Constitution. Instead, the reverse happens.
Yeah, but unfortunately, he would not be the only one in the dock. We talk about propagating information that's false. What about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that were never there?
And, look who's given him stature. He's had far more op-eds in the New York Times and Washington Post than you and I have had. And here he is, a man who writes in the Washington Post and New York Times advocating illegal policies of war and military action. And he gets in the New York Times. I remember once he got into the New York Times op-ed page and the Washington Post op-ed page the same day.
Yeah.
This is the most valuable media real estate in America. Why are they giving him such visibility when the New York Times and Washington Post won't take an op-ed from Noam Chomsky or the late Howard Zinn, the historian? What's going on here?
It testifies to what I call we have a warfare state. We have a state that celebrates the projection of power everywhere in the world. We give every country in the world a report card like they're little kids. It's Dean Acheson's theme of we're the locomotive of all mankind and everybody else is the caboose. Now, some are more decorous in projecting our warfare state than others. Mr. Bolton is especially acerbic. But even when we think about President Obama, President Obama won all these wars too. He starts them, bring them out, but now we were back into Iraq. We went into Libya without any authority, turned it into a wilderness, and called it peace. We're ready to go into. We went into Syria after ISIS. We're still in Afghanistan, and we started complaining about China to have an artificial island in the South China Sea because we're the only ones who can have a Monroe Doctrine. The duplicity, and it's everywhere. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's just a matter of how high on the scale of war are these people eager to go. That's why Bolton is a symbol of the malady, of our warfare malady. But it is a symbol, and it extends everywhere. You talk about the New York Times and Washington Post. Well, why wouldn't they give Bolton? Yeah, they use different language, but where are they out there campaigning against all these unconstitutional wars? I've written so many articles and letters to them saying, how come when you write about the wars, you never ask, what's the legal authority for doing this? Not once. They write all op-eds, and they have everything else, and they just ignore it. I remember there was one article that provoked me to write Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post. He said, it's only a fringe believes Congress has to vote on war. I said, yeah, well, that fringe includes James Madison, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. I said, what's your idea of the fringe group? All of our founding fathers. But that's what's really dismaying. Bolton kind of reaches a crescendo of alarm here, but it's across the board in the entire culture.
You're listening to Bruce Fein, who is a Republican and who worked in the Ronald Reagan Justice Department, just to show you that when it comes to the rule of law, there are a lot of conservatives and liberals, progressives on the same side. Bruce, we always urge our listeners to do things. And I think that there are things that can be done to stop Bolton, even if he gets in the White House in a few days, that he would be bolted out of the White House by enough pressure from around the country. So you mentioned that Congressman Foster, Democrat from Illinois, has put in a bill to make the National Security Advisor a confirmable post by the U.S. Senate. Tell us what you've done in terms of a proposed congressional resolution that might have a better chance to get through, because there are more than a few Republicans who detest John Bolton.
Yeah. The joint resolution identifies or enumerates at least many of the things that we've spoken on in this program today as disqualifying features of Mr. Bolton's background, and then expresses the sense of the House and the Senate that President Trump should either withdraw the nomination or submit it to the Senate for confirmation, even if because I think it's required under the Constitution, even without a statute, but that's more debatable. And this is a way, and this resolution is timely, no matter whether Bolton has actually assumed the office on April 10th or not. And so if you support, you could write into your member of Congress, write into your senator asking support a joint resolution that at least would voice the consensus of the Congress and the American people that Mr. Bolton is not fit to be your national security advisor. And including the fact that it's true, as you've stated, Ralph, Mr. Bolton epitomizes virtually all of the foreign policy that President Trump denounced when he was campaigning. Unfortunately, he hasn't denounced it in his actions once he's been inaugurated.
Well,
but certainly his campaign is opposite to everything Mr. Bolton has said in his entire career. The other thing, it seems to me, that's relevant here is to show just, I think, the character of Mr. Bolton. Shortly after his appointment was announced, he said, well, everything that I've said my entire 69 years before me, I'm now disowning. Now I'm just working for Mr. Trump, because he saw that they were on a collision course if he stuck to any of those opinions, which showed how much he is willing to be crass, how to prostitute himself in order to obtain the power. Now, somebody who is willing to basically undertake that, what you might call self-immolation, with regard to his past ideas, in order to get in office, is not someone who can be trusted. It's someone who revels in the exercise of power for its own sake.
Well, someone who worked with him testified in Congress, calling him abusive of his subordinates and sycophant toward his superiors.
Yes, that's true. I'm not sure that doesn't cause me as much alarm as the fact that it's obvious that he revels in his self-identity as being at the center of power, and those are the people that should frighten you, because it means that he gets his psychological thrills out of projecting force and killing, and not diplomacy and peace.
How could our listeners get a copy of your resolution and Congressman Foster's bill so they can urge their own senators and representatives to support both? Because this is all going to heat up. John Bolton, in my opinion, is a clear and present danger to the United States itself, because this kind of aggression boomerangs. It's what the CIA calls blowback. And if his position is held and overrides Secretary of Defense Mattis, who's going to have great trouble working with John Bolton in the White House, the explosions will start in the U.S. No longer are two oceans barricading the U.S. from boomeranging military and foreign policies that are supporting dictators abroad, oppression, violating laws, drones, special forces, destroyed countries like Libya and Iraq. What do you say about that? Can you tell our listeners how they can get this information?
Well, you can go on the internet. There's an internet site that tracks all congressional bills and resolutions, and that is one easy way to retrieve it. And even if that's something that you haven't been able to track down, just writing into your member and demanding that there's a joint resolution and a statute. They don't work at loggerheads. They work in tandem. The statute by the congressman and the joint resolution that I've sent to Senator Mike Lee's office of Utah. And when you express your views, that will have resonance, especially when it's your personal understanding and ideas, and it's not simply putting on a stamp, something that's been concocted by somebody else. Citizens can never underestimate the influence they can have with those who are in authority. If it's thoughtful, and never think that it's not worth it because you're only one of 309 million. That's simply not the way self-government operates. You got to get involved. You can't be, well, I won't do it unless I know I'll prevail. You got to do it because it's the right thing to do.
And it looks like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal are busy digging into John Bolton's past, and there's a very fertile amount of past in John Bolton to further put public pressure on Donald Trump to reconsider this appointment. Steve, do you have any comments or questions of Bruce Fein?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Mr. Fein, who are some of the prominent Republicans in Congress who'd be with you on this?
Everything, unfortunately, up there in Congress depends upon how much power they think the president wields. Everybody's intimidated. Not everybody, but most are, getting an adverse tweet by Mr. Trump. That's how invertebrate they are. Certainly some who I think would be receptive, say Mike Lee, Rand Paul would be on the Senate side, Walter Jones, Ted Yoho, Republicans, and the House side, Thomas Massey, Republican also, somebody who would be worried. Another one on the Senate side that it's important, I think, because it would normally go for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to Bob Corker. Corker is the chairman now, but he's not running for re-election. So you have a little more leeway if you're not worried about Trump's ability to raise money against you in the next election to be candid in your views.
Because John Bolton is a torture advocate, maybe John McCain can speak out against him.
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, Mr. McCain, he hasn't been back in the Senate for a while because he's severely ill. I don't know whether it's possible. You don't like to be engaged in mortality guesses, but I don't know the strength of his ability to do a whole lot. They keep medical information rather confidential, but he's not been present at many of the sessions of
but his Senate office is putting out a lot of statements by him regularly. He's active, even though he's back receiving treatment in Arizona.
Well, true enough. So, listen, as long as he's there, and he certainly is the one who is responsible for the Detainee Treatment Act and the denunciation of the so-called the waterboarding, the enhanced interrogation techniques, and Mr. Bolton is in favor of everything that you can think of short of the rack and the screw in fighting and believing in Carthaginian pieces. It is frightening to just think somebody who's so committed to force, and more force. There's no variation, there's no subtlety. All it is carrying a big stick and using a big stick and nothing in between.
The shame of Yale Law School, from which he graduated, and he is the trumpet for empire and military power being used all over the world. As we close, Bruce Fein, tell our listeners the names of your two books.
Well, the most recent is American Empire Before the Fall. It really traces some of the themes that we've broached today about the warfare state and power for the sake of power, the destruction of the Fourth Amendment, the rule of law, the constitutional entrustment of Congress to decide on war and peace, and why it's critical that if we don't open our eyes and see where we're headed, we will crumble like all other empires by overreach. In many respects, we look like the British Empire on the edge of World War I, believing that rule Britannia would be forever as they then began the decline and fall of the British Empire. The other book is The Constitutional Peril, the life and death struggle of our Constitution and democracy. And it explores, the depth of our constitutional illiteracy and the danger we confront when we forget that it's process. It's procedure that is our protection. Due process, I think, as Ralph said, perhaps the most important concept ever developed in the history of civilization, the idea you could be wrong. You got to make sure that you get things right, you hear people, and you have impartial decision-making, not biased, in order to maintain a rule of law. You can buy those on Amazon, and I think they'll be a refreshing read. It's not something you'll find explored in the op-ed pages of the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or Washington Post.
Well, thank you for your consistent standing up for the Constitution and the rule of law and challenging empire, Bruce Fein.
All right. Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking to constitutional scholar Bruce Fein. We will link to all of his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 6, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Democracy is best served when elected officials are wholly committed to representing the public interest. When government is for sale, it destroys public trust in democratic institutions and denies people the right to accountable, responsive government and the rule of law. Who says this? A new group called the Coalition for Integrity, previously known as Transparency International USA. Why didn't it just stay as Transparency International USA? Because last year, the parent group, Transparency International, stripped the USA affiliate of its title. Transparency International USA had increasingly been seen in the United States as a corporate front group funded by multinational corporations, the same multinationals that corrupt the U.S. political system. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Ralph, and we're going to shift gears. See what I did there, Ralph? Shift gears, because we're going to be talking about cars. We're going to talk to the man who Madison Avenue Magazine said is, quote, out to change the way Americans buy their cars, and he has. Jack Gillis is Director of Public Affairs for the Consumer Federation of America. Previously, he spent 3 years with the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he was responsible for developing the government's automotive information program. He spent 10 years as a contributing correspondent for NBC's Today Show and Consumer Affairs, and for over 30 years has co-authored The Car Book, the annual guide that has provided invaluable assistance to consumers in the ever more complex process of buying a car. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jack Gillis.
Well, thank you.
Jack, this is clearly the America's most comprehensive car buying guide, which is a statement you have on the cover of this immensely usable, practical book for anybody who wants to buy a car, anybody who wants to learn how better to buy a car, and many, many other important consumer advisories. This is the 38th edition, annual edition, of The Car Book, 2018, by Jack Gillis. And I can't begin to describe how usable this is, listeners, but the bulk of the book goes through dozens and dozens of car models: the Fiat 500, the Chrysler 300, the Chevrolet Bolt, the Tesla vehicle, the Buick LaCrosse, the Lincoln Navigator, the Honda Pilot, the Infiniti Q50. And they have one page on each of these, and they will rate them on combination crash tests, safety features, rollover, preventive maintenance, repair costs, warranty, fuel economy, complaints, and insurance costs. The ratings are 10 are the best and 1 is the worst. And then it just goes through just the kind of information that you want. It's the kind of book that anticipates every question you have about buying a car and making the right choice for yourself. So let me start. This is a curious story about how Jack Gillis got this underway. When you worked for NHTSA, the Auto Safety Agency in the Department of Transportation, over 38 years ago, and you put out the Car Book, and Joan Claybrook, who was running NHTSA at that time, got on the Donahue Show. And tell us what happened.
Well, it became the most popular publication ever issued by Pueblo, Colorado, the government facility in Colorado. And it was really popular because it provided taxpayers with access to millions of dollars worth of information about cars, which was heretofore unavailable. What we did at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was we translated complex crash test scores, repair costs, insurance costs into easy-to-use and understand charts. And our philosophy was that if consumers knew that car A was safer than car B, they would buy car A, and that would put enormous marketplace pressure on the manufacturers to make improvements in the safety of the vehicles.
And then what happened?
Well, I stayed on for a bit of time under the Reagan administration. This was published under the auspices of Jimmy Carter, who had appointed Joan Claybrook as the head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And I stayed on hoping that President Reagan would continue this publication because it was very free marketplace oriented. That is, it gave consumers information and let them make informed choices. Unfortunately, the car companies put enormous pressure on then Secretary of Transportation Drew Lewis, and he canceled the publication. So I resigned from the government, and working with the Center for Auto Safety and its director at that time, Clarence Stitlow, we cobbled together the first privately published edition. And about the time when I was ready to publish this, I was still working at the government, and I was ensuring that all of the data that I was collecting for what was going to be the 1982 edition of the book was all publicly available. There was no secret information that I had access to. And we published it, and it became a huge sensation. I also appeared on the Donahue Show with Clarence in 1982, and the book just took off, providing evidence that consumers were desperately in need of good, solid, unbiased, comparative safety and performance information.
Well, the laudatory comments from people who are real veterans of the consumer safety movement are amazing on this book. Robert Krugoff, the legendary president of Consumers Checkbook, the Center for Study of Services, he says, quote, which vehicle is best for you, which is the safest, has the fewest complaints, and is the least expensive to buy, fuel, maintain, repair, and insure. The car book's ratings are the answers you need, end quote. So try to explain the various parts of this book, Jack, because it's not just one page on each model, like the Jeep Cherokee or the Toyota Prius or the Volvo V60. It has immensely usable, clearly written information and step-by-step advice to car buyers.
Well, that's right, Ralph. Let's face it, for most of us, this is one of the most complex and important and expensive products that we'll ever buy. First and foremost, not only is the product so complex, but we're matching wits with a seasoned professional who has been trained to get as much money out of our pocketbooks as possible.
You're talking about the dealers,
I'm talking
and the
about
salesmen.
the dealers, right? The dealer salespeople. Most of us really disdain the process of buying a car. Again, we're matching wits with a seasoned professional. We don't negotiate for that much on a day-to-day basis, and yet they're trained and do it every single day. So what we wanted to do was give consumers two things. One, the subjective information they needed to determine which car was the safest, which car had the best warranty, which car had the lowest insurance costs. So those are the important criteria that consumers need to look at before they choose. And then the next thing we wanted to do was give consumers the tools they needed to make a good, solid choice once they got in the showroom. Simple steps that you can take to make sure that the dealer doesn't take advantage of you and you get the best price possible.
And you have a section called depreciation and the difference between leasing and buying. What is all that about?
Well, first of all, leasing has become very popular, unfortunately, because of low monthly lease costs. However, one of the things that we tell consumers is that whenever you lease, you're always going to pay more for that car than if you were able to eke out the monthly payments on a time payment plan. And that's because the sticker shock often comes at the end of the lease, when you go to turn in that vehicle and you suddenly get socked with excess mileage charges, excess wear and tear charges, and other things. The other problem with leasing is you are perpetually renting a vehicle. Whereas if you could buy a car, and today's cars will last at least 150 to 175,000 miles in most cases, if you buy that car, after your payment plan is over, whether it's 2, 3, 4, or sometimes 5 years, you have now a tangible asset and no monthly payment. So you're always going to do better if you can buy the vehicle versus leasing the vehicle. And we walk consumers through the numbers and the nuts and bolts in that decision.
You sure do, by brand name. Then you have a section called 5 Basic Steps to Car Buying. And then what happens when you're in the showroom? You said the first point you make is beware of silence. Silence is often used to intimidate, so be prepared for long periods of time when the salesperson is, quote, talking with the manager, end quote. This tactic is designed to make you want to, quote, just get the negotiations over with, end quote. And then it tells you how to deal with that. And it shows don't fall in love with a car. Keep your wallet in your pocket. Shop at the end of the month. What's that about?
Well, I think that one of the things that salespeople need is to meet certain quotas. And often, if they haven't met those quotas by the end of the month, they're much more willing to negotiate a better price for that vehicle than at the beginning of the month. And I think one of the things that I really strongly recommend is don't talk price until you're ready to buy. You should make at least 2 trips to the showroom. The first trip is to simply check the vehicles out and take a good long test drive. A lot of us are intimidated at the test drive and we maybe just drive it around the block, but most of the problems that we often have with our vehicles could have been avoided if you brought it home, pulled it into your driveway, tried it out in your garage, pull out onto the highway, and make sure that the car performs in a way that you feel comfortable. Once you've narrowed your choice down to 2 or 3 cars, then you can start talking price with the dealer. But keep in mind, the best way to get a good price is to pit the dealers against each other. Unfortunately, that takes a long time, which is why we recommend the Car Bargain Service, which is issued by Washington Consumer Checkbook, and it's a nonprofit comparative purchasing service.
Yeah, and very useful. This book has about 280 pages. It's magazine size, and you don't have to memorize all this, listeners. You don't have to retain it. You just take this book with you to the dealer. First of all, the moment the salesperson sees that you have this book, the salesperson might, turn white for a minute, but what the salesperson is going to say to herself or himself, this customer cannot be fooled. This customer cannot be deceived just by having the book there. You recommend sometimes buying last year's model or buying from stock or ordering a car. Tell us about those key points.
Well, again, the longer the car sits on a dealer's lot, the more the dealer ends up paying to finance that vehicle himself or herself. So cars that have been around for a while, there's a much higher likelihood that they'll negotiate a better price for that vehicle. On the other hand, the cars on the lot may contain features that you think are overpriced or you don't necessarily want. You may not want leather seats and all the fancy new gadgetry that can come as additional options on certain vehicles. So in that case, don't hesitate to order the vehicle exactly the way you want it, and that means you won't be overpaying for the vehicle or buying some parts of the vehicle that you don't really need.
You also have a section on lemon laws, state by state. So listeners, he describes the lemon law in your state, whether it's California or Connecticut. And this is something we worked on with Clarence Ditlow and others years ago. Tell people what the lemon law is all about and how successful it is when it's used by you, the car buyer.
Well, no matter how hard you try, sometimes you'll end up with what is called a lemon, a car that just doesn't really function well for a variety of reasons. And each of the states now have laws which protect you. And basically, in a nutshell, those laws will consider a car to be a lemon and require that the manufacturer buy it back if you've had 3 or 4 unsuccessful repairs for the vehicle, or it's been out of service for 30 days or more, and it's within 1 or 2 years of the warranty. So don't hesitate. If you've got a car that's causing you problems, check with your state attorney general, find out what the details are in the lemon law in your state, and follow up. If it's been out of service for over 30 days, there's a reasonable chance that you can unload that car back to the manufacturer.
You have a very good section on tires, how to read a tire, a sampling of top-rated tires by brand name, tire ratings, tips for dealing with a mechanic, repair protection by credit card, service contracts, what you have to watch out on the service contracts. The one that caught my attention was on page 4849 on insurance, different kind of insurance, and then you have a page reducing insurance costs. Can you give us a bit on that?
Sure. It's important. 2 things are important, Ralph. One is you want to shop around for insurance with the same vigor that you shopped around for the car. Insurance companies can charge vastly different rates for virtually the same car. So it's good to get at least 3 estimates for the cost of insuring that particular vehicle. Secondly, once you've nailed down your insurance, you want to make sure you get all the discounts you're entitled to. And there's a lot that most people don't understand. Non-drinkers, non-smokers can get a discount. If you're a farmer, you can get a discount. If you carpool, you can get a discount. Even mature drivers 50 and older, may qualify for up to 10% discount or a lower price bracket. So each of the companies usually has anywhere from 10 to 15 different types of discounts. And you want to make sure that you understand those discounts and get credit for the ones you qualify for.
We're talking with Jack Gillis, the longtime author of the annual car book, 2018 edition, just out from the Center for Auto Safety in Washington, D.C. I noticed you have very good things for child safety, families with kids, on warning about incorrect child safety seat installation, and be alert to child safety seat recalls and seat belts for kids. Very, very important. You also have a critical eye on the self-driving vehicle hype, but you do talk about existing available automatic safety protection, like automatic braking systems or various automatic crash protection systems that are available either as standard equipment or options. We're all trying to get them to be standard equipment. You've got a page on what's coming in the future. But here's what I think people really would want to know about. 5 factors affecting fuel economy and 12 ways to save money at the pump. How about that?
Well, I think that, gasoline for most households is a major, major expense. And unfortunately, as we speak today, the government is attempting to roll back very reasonable, very achievable fuel efficiency standards. And that rollback will not only cost the American consumer dearly in their pocketbooks, but it's going to hurt the competitiveness of the American car companies. There's no question that the foreign manufacturers are going to meet the standards. But as the government rolls back these standards, inevitably the domestics will ease up on their efforts to improve fuel efficiency, and there's a reasonably good chance that we'll find ourselves 3 or 4 years from now when gas prices inevitably go up in the same position we did years ago when we had to bail out the car companies because they had too many fuel-efficient vehicles. So consumers can, however, protect themselves with the variety of fuel-efficient tips that we put in. First and foremost, you want to buy a fuel-efficient vehicle. And secondly, various driving techniques and things you can do to reduce the cost at the pump are very important. Probably one of the most easy ones to do is don't use high-octane fuel. 98% of the vehicles operate very well on regular fuel. So you don't need to buy into the oil company's hype and how important it is to use mid-grade or high-grade fuel. Check your owner's manual. If it says regular, use regular.
You also have a section on comparing warranties, secret warranties, technical service bulletins. This book should sell in the millions because there are millions of car buyers, new cars, used cars. It should be part of consumer skill courses in our high schools. And tell us how they can get this book, either in print. In print is much better than online, but it's offered online as well. Tell our listeners.
Easiest way is to go to autosafety.org, and all of the information will be there on buying the car. It's if you want the printed edition, it's $25. If you want to go online, you can become a member of the center and get free access, or you can just pay $10 for 30 days worth of access to the online version of the car book from the Center for Auto Safety.
And the $25 pays for the book and only part of the postage, so you're getting a quick deal here. Thank you very much, Jack Gillis, the greatest promoter of car safety information of all. Thank you for your work over the years and for your daring departure from the U.S. government that suppressed the car book under Ronald Reagan to get it out to the American people under the auspices of the Center for Auto Safety.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate you saying that, and it was a great opportunity to talk about the car book with consumers.
Yes, indeed.
We've been speaking to Jack Gillis, co-author of the Car Book. We will link to the Car Book 2018 at ralphnaderradiohour.com. So, Ralph, we have time for one listener question here, and actually it's pretty interesting because this week 2 listeners called our attention to it. One, Emily Adams, and another listener named Chris Lamb. And Emily wrote that your name came up during the interview of UCLA law professor Adam Winkler on Fresh Air, which posted a couple of weeks ago, in which Winkler cited a case of yours as actually, and get this, paving the way for Citizens United. And this is what was said.
So the corporation that has a constitutional right to criticize a corrupt politician becomes the same as a big money-making corporation's right to express its views in the form of political contributions.
That's right. And a key turning point in this process is a surprising case brought by Ralph Nader in the 1970s. And Ralph Nader, on behalf of consumers, takes a case to the Supreme Court challenging a ban on pharmacists advertising drug prices. And he's trying to help consumers so that they can comparison shop and get the cheapest prices. And his case becomes a landmark victory in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says the First Amendment protects the rights of consumers, of the listeners of speech, not just the rights of the speaker. And indeed, the speaker's identity doesn't matter. That same theory of the First Amendment would be adopted by Citizens United and other courts since then, saying that the identity of the corporate speaker in election campaigns is irrelevant. All that matters is whether the speech itself is valuable to the listeners or consumers. So in some ways, Ralph Nader gave us Citizens United.
What do you say to that, Ralph?
Well, I would say to Adam Winkler, that's a stretch. His book is good. It shows how corporations have, over the decades, grabbed civil rights in order to have the same rights as real people. That's called the corporate personhood movement, which our listeners are quite familiar with. But in answer to his first question, I didn't bring the case. It was brought by our litigation group of Public Citizen, and it was focused on consumer protection. It was focused on removing a state prohibition on pharmacies from advertising their prices so people could compare prices from pharmacy to pharmacy and buying pharmaceuticals. Then the Supreme Court, 5-4, so in answer to Professor Winkler, 5 Supreme Court justices gave us Citizens United, grotesquely misinterpreted the Virginia pharmacy case and moved it from consumer rights to uninhibited political contribution rights by corporations for and against all kinds of candidates for office. So 5-4 is not the first time the Supreme Court has grotesquely expanded and inappropriately interpreted a prior judicial decision. There's a national movement led by Public Citizen and a group led by Jeffrey Clements, a Boston attorney who wrote the book Corporations Are Not People, to neutralize or reverse the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United.
Well, thank you, Chris and Emily, for bringing that to our attention. And thanks, Ralph, for your answer. Thank you all for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guests again, constitutional scholar Bruce Fein and car buying expert Jack Gillis, co-author of the Car Book 2018. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap Up. For Ralph's weekly column, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. Visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org. And check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome former IRS Commissioner, a favorite target of congressional Republicans, John Koskinen. Thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, and listeners, help everybody in Washington trying to give John Bolton the Bolt.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where Steve continues to talk cars with author of the Car Book, Jack Gillis.
It's funny, first of all, Ralph, how you talk about bringing this car book in like it's bringing a gun into a saloon. All you need to do is show them you got the gun.
Only it's a very nonviolent gun.
A nonviolent gun, but it's just as scary, apparently.
Yeah.
What kind of car do you drive?
Well, I have a 2008 Hyundai Azera. I tend to keep my cars for a long time.
And what about that car? Not that we need to promote the Hyundai Azera, but what were some of the criteria that you use for yourself?
Sure. 2 things. One, of course, my bias is safety, so I wanted to buy a vehicle that got really good crash test results. And secondly, the Hyundai product is extraordinarily well priced. So when I bought that car 10 years ago, I think it was about $24,000. It is very competitive to the Honda Accord, Toyota Camry, which were $6,000-$7,000 more. So when Hyundai decided to change its approach to car building, the original Hyundais that came into this country were pretty shoddy. But the Korean manufacturers decided, let's try to compete heavily with the Japanese. And they, in effect, overbuilt their vehicles, and some would say maybe dumped them on the U.S., but they tend to be a great value when compared to their competition.
You tell car buyers how to check recalls, don't you, in this book?
Yes, we do.
So, Jack, when you, I'm thinking, when you walk onto a showroom floor, do they have your picture up somewhere?
Yeah.
Is this you're like a Vegas card counter? They won't let you into the casino?
Sometimes it's a little embarrassing because what happens is they rub their hands together and say, well, we're going to show this know-it-all. We're going to show him that we know more than he does. So I hate to even identify myself in a showroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would like to take you with me the next time I go. So,
well, you can take the book.
I'll take the book. I would rather take you. And so when the guy goes in the back and says, I need to talk to my boss, and you could tell me exactly what they're talking about and how to respond to that.
And just in a nutshell, the best way to respond to that is what I call the 180-degree turn. Just get up and start walking towards the door, because you don't have a lot of time to fool around with this. And the minute you start walking towards the door, I guarantee you they'll be back.
Yeah, I've heard that technique. Very good.